It's completely gone. What are we gonna do now? You should have fixed this when you had the chance.
6:14 a.m., 9 days after they built it. I stepped off my back porch in rubber boots, coffee in my left hand, and stopped at the property line. The road was gone. Not damaged, not flooded. Gone. 40 feet of compacted gravel and fill material, swallowed by a water table that had been building pressure beneath the surface for 9 days. Where the road had been, standing water 2 feet deep, buckled base material jutting from the mud, and cattails already pushing through the cracks. I had built a 4-month paper trail, Army Corps complaint, parallel state filing, 41 time-stamped photographs, certified mail receipts the board had signed and never answered. I had expected the paperwork to be the weapon. The wetland had other plans. 4 months earlier, the Ridgecrest HOA had placed a community notice in my mailbox. A 12-foot gravel access road, approved at last month's board meeting. Construction in 3 weeks. 3 paragraphs. No mention of the federal permit required. No mention of the 2017 jurisdictional designation of Cobble Creek. No mention of the Clean Water Act. No mention of the water table. My neighbor Diana had been a state environmental compliance officer for 22 years. She read the notice standing in my kitchen doorway. Took less than a minute. Then she looked at me and said, "They never filed with the Army Corps. I filed 2 complaints the night they broke ground. Then I waited. The wetland didn't." Before we jump in, drop where you're watching from in the comments, smash that like button, and hit subscribe for more insane stories like this. Marcus Webb steps out of his back door in rubber boots, coffee still steaming in his left hand, and stops completely at the edge of his property line. The road is gone. He stands there for a full 10 seconds without moving. His mind runs through the obvious explanations, the way a mind does when it encounters something that refuses to make sense. Maybe the light is wrong. Maybe the fog is distorting the distance. Maybe he is simply not awake yet, and the familiar shape of that gravel stretch will resolve itself in a moment. But the moment passes, then another. The fog does not shift. The light does not change. The road is gone, not damaged, not partially flooded, gone, as if the earth had simply decided it was finished tolerating the intrusion. Where Ridgecrest HOA had laid 40 feet of gravel fill and compacted base material across the Cobble Creek buffer zone just 9 days ago, there is now standing water 2 feet deep in places, buckled fragments of asphalt base jutting from the mud at broken angles, and cattails already pushing upward through the cracks like the land was exhaling after holding its breath for a week and a half. Marcus sets his coffee on the nearby fence post without looking at it. He pulls his phone from his jacket pocket and begins walking. Every step toward the water's edge sinks slightly. The saturated ground pulls at his boots with a quiet, persistent resistance. The same resistance the HOA had dismissed as manageable when they drove the excavator onto this ground 9 days ago. The same resistance the fill material had spent 9 days failing to overcome. He reaches the nearest point of the collapse and crouches down, photographing the exposed cross-section of gravel and subbase material, now sitting half submerged in dark water. He moves methodically along the length of it. Every section of exposed fill gets its own photograph. Every visible fracture in the remaining base material. Every place where standing water has pooled over what was, just over a week ago, compacted ground. He photographs the cattails breaking through the cracks. Not because they are legally significant, but because he wants the record to show exactly how quickly the wetland moved once the pressure was released. He has seen wetlands reclaim disturbed ground before. Small encroachments, poorly anchored fill, grading work done too close to the waterline. He has seen it take months, sometimes years. He has never seen it happen in 9 days. The collapse runs the full 40-foot length of the road. Not one section failed. The entire structure has subsided, fractured, and been partially swallowed by the rising water table. The centerline crack Diana had warned him about theoretically, the point where hydrostatic pressure beneath a compromised fill layer would find its weakest axis, is visible from one end to the other, straight as a survey line, as if the earth had drawn it with a level. He straightens up and looks at what remains. There is something almost surgical about it. The land on either side of the former road is untouched. The trees along the buffer zone edge stand exactly where they stood before the equipment arrived. The creek channel runs clear in the distance, unhurried, moving the way it has moved through this ground for longer than anyone in Ridgecrest has been alive. Only the space where the road was looks different, and it looks different the way a healed wound looks different from a fresh one. The acute phase is finished. What remains is the land returning to itself. Marcus walks back to the porch and picks up the manila folder he had set on the railing before coming outside. He had placed it there the night before, deliberately, the way you set something near the door when you know the morning will require it. It is thick. 4 months of accumulated work, assembled page by page, the way Diana had insisted from the beginning. Not in a rush, not reactively, but steadily, with the kind of patience that builds something a regulator can actually use. Inside sits the original HOA development notice, dated October, with Marcus's handwritten margin annotations from the first reading, his formal written objection sent certified mail, and the signed return receipt confirming delivery. The board's non-response, documented not by a letter they sent, but by the absence of one, with the delivery confirmation attached to prove the silence was chosen, not accidental. Behind those sits Diana's 4-page technical assessment, written in the precise, citation-dense language of someone who spent 2 decades producing documents exactly like it, identifying the Section 404 violation by statute, referencing the 2017 jurisdictional survey by file number, and laying out the specific construction activities that constituted unauthorized discharge of fill material into federal waters. Then the photographs, 41 of them, printed and labeled, organized across every day of construction, GPS coordinates in the caption, timestamps confirmed against the phone's metadata, every load of fill material, every equipment track in the exposed soil, every visible point where gravel contacted open water in the creek channel. Diana had organized them chronologically, with a 1-line description beneath each one in her precise handwriting. The description's clinical and exact. Fill placement over designated buffer zone. Eastern margin. Day 3. 10:42 a.m. Behind the photographs sits his formal Section 404 complaint to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Buffalo District. Submitted with all 41 photographs attached and a cover letter Diana had reviewed 3 times before he sent it. Diana's parallel report to the State Department of Environmental Conservation, and 3 letters from the Army Corps, the first acknowledging receipt of his complaint, the second confirming that the Cobble Creek buffer zone designation remained active in their jurisdictional records, and the third, dated 6 days ago, stating that a field inspector had been assigned to the matter and would be in contact to schedule a site assessment. He had been building this file since the first notice arrived in his mailbox. He had built it carefully, without shortcuts, the way Diana had described the process on the very first day. You are not trying to win an argument. You are building a record. Records outlast arguments. He had expected the file to be the weapon. He had not expected the wetland to move first. Marcus stands at the edge of Cobble Creek for a long time, folder in his right hand, watching the mist lift off the dark water where a road used to be. The morning light is coming up slowly through the tree line to the east, laying a thin gold edge along the water's surface. A great blue heron stands motionless in the shallows 20 feet downstream, completely indifferent to the collapsed gravel and the standing water and the entire 4-month ordeal that had brought Marcus to this particular spot at this particular hour. Somewhere beneath the surface, the unauthorized fill material is still there. The collapse had not removed it, it had revealed it. The fracture lines and subsidence points have exposed the fill cross-section in a way that no surface photograph could capture alone. Any inspector who walks this site now will be standing inside the evidence, not looking at it from the outside. They will see exactly what was placed, how deep it went, where it contacted the subsurface drainage corridor, and how the hydrostatic failure progressed from edge to center. The collapse has turned the violation into a 3-dimensional document. The wetland had not just reclaimed itself, it had created evidence. Marcus opens the folder and looks at the 3rd Army Corps letter, the one confirming that Agent Reyes had been assigned and would be in contact. He had been waiting for that contact for 6 days, checking his phone each morning with the focused patience of someone who knows the system moves slowly, but has no choice except to let it move. He had prepared for a long regulatory process: complaint, assessment, findings, enforcement, restoration order. Each stage taking weeks, the whole arc potentially stretching into spring or summer. He looks back at the water. Agent Reyes is going to walk onto a site that has already confessed. Marcus closes the folder. He picks up his coffee from the fence post, cold now, but he drinks it anyway, and stands in the early morning quiet of a wetland that has done in 9 days what 4 months of paperwork was still building toward. Not faster than justice, not instead of it, alongside it, moving at the speed of water and pressure and a water table that simply refused to be relocated. He pulls out his phone and sends Diana a single message. "You need to come see this." Her reply arrives in 40 seconds. "On my way." 4 months earlier, a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of morning that arrives cold and clear after the first hard frost of the season. The oak leaves along Marcus's driveway turned fully and beginning to fall in slow, unhurried drifts across the gravel. He walks to the mailbox at the end of the drive the way he does every morning, unhurried, coffee in hand, half his attention still back in the house. He opens the box and pulls out a small stack, a utility bill, a catalog he never subscribed to, and a single-page document printed on Ridgecrest HOA letterhead. He reads the header standing at the mailbox. Community Development Notice. Proposed Access Road. Phase 1, Cobble Creek Corridor. He reads the first paragraph, then the second. Then he folds the catalog under his arm, leaves the utility bill in the box, and walks back to the house with the HOA notice held flat in his hand, like something that needed to be handled carefully. At the kitchen table, with a fresh cup of coffee and a yellow highlighter, he reads it a third time. 3 paragraphs total. The first paragraph describes the project. A gravel access road, 12 feet wide, running 40 feet through the eastern edge of the Cobble Creek buffer zone to connect the HOA's maintenance staging area to the rear utility corridor. The second paragraph states that the project had been approved by the Ridgecrest HOA board at its October meeting. The third paragraph gives a construction start date of the second week of November and invites residents with questions to contact the board's community liaison. That is everything the notice contains. No environmental assessment attached, no wetland delineation survey, no mention of the water table, the federal buffer designation, the Army Corps of Engineers, or the Clean Water Act. No permit numbers because there are no permits. No regulatory citations because no one at the board level has apparently asked whether any were required. The language is precise in all the wrong places. Specific about the road's dimensions, specific about the timeline, specific about which board meeting produced the vote, and completely, perfectly silent on every legal threshold the project would need to cross before a single piece of equipment touched that ground. Marcus highlights 3 phrases. He photographs the letter front and back with his phone. He opens his laptop, creates a new folder on the desktop labeled HOA Road, Cobble Creek, and saves the images inside it. He sits for a moment, looking at the folder name on his screen. Then he puts on his jacket and walks across the property to the house next door. Diana answers the door before he knocks. She has seen him crossing the yard from her kitchen window and already has the door open by the time he reaches the steps. She has known Marcus for 11 years, long enough to read the particular quality of his expression when something has gone wrong, in a way that requires attention rather than reassurance. He hands her the notice without saying anything. She reads it standing in her doorway, one hand resting on the doorframe. She does not read it twice. Diana spent 22 years as an environmental compliance officer for the state, reviewing land use permits, wetland impact assessments, fill activity applications, and Section 404 documentation packages. She has processed hundreds of them. She knows what a complete filing looks like, and she knows, within the first paragraph, what this is not. She lowers the notice and looks at Marcus. "They never filed with the Army Corps," she says. Her voice has the flat, certain quality of someone stating a measurement rather than an opinion. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act requires a federal permit for any discharge of dredge or fill material into waters of the United States. That includes wetlands. Cobble Creek's buffer zone was designated jurisdictional in 2017. I reviewed that filing myself. I was still working when it came through. Marcus asks what that means practically, what it means for what the HOA can and cannot do. Diana sets the notice on her kitchen counter and turns to face him directly. "It means this road cannot be legally constructed without a 404 permit," she says. Full stop. They have not applied for one. Those applications are public record through the Army Corps database. And I checked this morning after I saw the equipment notice posted on the community board last week. There is no active application for this corridor. There is no pending permit. What they have sent you is a community notice. It is not an authorization. It is not a permit. They are treating a federal compliance process like a neighborhood newsletter announcement. She pauses for a moment, looking at the notice on the counter. They may not know the difference between the two, she says. That does happen. Boards move forward on projects without ever asking whether federal jurisdiction applies. Or, she pauses again, with the measured consideration of someone who has seen both versions play out. They may know perfectly well and be counting on nobody in the neighborhood knowing enough to push back. Marcus asks her which she thinks it is. She looks at him steadily. It doesn't matter which it is. The outcome is the same either way if no one does anything. He asks what they should do. Diana pulls a notepad from the drawer beside her refrigerator, a habit from 22 years of field work, the reflex of someone who processes information by writing it down, and sets it on the counter beside the notice. You document everything, she says. Starting today, starting right now. Every communication from the HOA goes into a file with the date it was received. Every conversation you have with board members gets a written summary within 24 hours. If they break ground, and based on this notice they intend to in 3 weeks, you photograph every day of construction, every piece of equipment on that ground, every load of fill material, every point where their activity contacts the water, timestamps, GPS coordinates, the works. She writes something on the notepad and slides it across the counter to him. It is a statute citation. 33 U.S.C. Section 1344, Section 404, Clean Water Act. That is the legal basis, she says. If they place fill in that wetland without a permit, every cubic yard they move is a federal violation. The record you build between now and then is what determines what the Army Corps can do with it when the time comes. Regulators can only act on what is documented. You are going to make sure there is nothing left undocumented. Marcus looks at the citation on the notepad. Then he looks at the notice on the counter. And if they just ignore it, he asks, if they build anyway and nothing happens? Diana picks up her pen again. Then we make sure something happens, she says. That is what the paper trail is for. That evening, at his kitchen table with Diana's statute citation beside him and the HOA notice flat on the desk, Marcus drafts a formal written objection to the Ridgecrest HOA board. The letter cites Section 404 of the Clean Water Act by statute number. It references the 2017 jurisdictional designation of Cobble Creek by survey date and file designation. It requests, in clear and specific language, written confirmation from the board that a federal Section 404 permit had been obtained and was in effect before any construction activity commenced in the Cobble Creek buffer zone. It informs the board that, in the absence of such confirmation, Marcus Webb would treat any construction activity as an unauthorized fill event and report it accordingly to the relevant federal and state agencies. He prints 2 copies. He drives to the post office before it closes and sends both copies certified mail with return receipt requested, one addressed to the HOA board president, one to the community management office. He keeps the tracking numbers and photographs the receipts. He checks the tracking portal the following Tuesday morning. Both letters have been delivered and signed for. He does not receive a response that week. He does not receive a response the week after that. He does not receive a response at all. What he receives instead, on the second Wednesday of November, is the sound of a truck engine on the access road at 7:15 in the morning. And then, a few minutes later, the low mechanical groan of an excavator bucket lowering toward the ground. He is already putting on his boots. The sound reaches Marcus before the light does. He is standing at the kitchen counter at 7:15 in the morning, waiting for the coffee to finish, when he hears it, a heavy diesel engine on the access road, moving slowly, the particular low-frequency rumble of something with significant weight behind it. Not a delivery truck, not a passenger vehicle, something with track tension and hydraulic mass, the kind of sound that belongs on a construction site. He does not finish pouring his coffee. He picks up his phone from the counter, walks straight to the back door, and steps outside in his socks before remembering his boots. He goes back, pulls them on without unlacing them, and is on the porch within 90 seconds of hearing the engine. The yellow excavator is already turning off the main access road onto the corridor path leading toward the Cobble Creek buffer zone. Behind it, a flatbed truck carries a crew of 6 and a load of gravel fill, secured under orange strapping. The excavator moves with the unhurried confidence of equipment that has been told exactly where to go and has no reason to expect anyone will tell it to stop. Marcus begins filming. He holds the phone steady, two hands, the way Diana had shown him. Landscape orientation, timestamp visible in the upper corner of every clip. Enough context in the frame to establish location. He films the excavator completing its turn. He films the flatbed parking along the corridor edge and the crew beginning to unload. He films the excavator operator lowering the cab window and exchanging a few words with the crew foreman. Ordinary, procedural, completely unaware of being documented. At 7:44 a.m., the excavator bucket lowers toward the eastern edge of the Cobble Creek buffer zone for the first time. Marcus watches through his phone screen as the teeth of the bucket make contact with the ground. The protected surface breaks. Soil that has held water and root systems and the slow, patient ecology of a functioning wetland for decades opens under 3,000 pounds of hydraulic pressure in a single, indifferent motion. The bucket lifts. The first load of protected material rises, turns in the air, and drops into a spoil pile 6 feet to the side. Marcus sends Diana 2 words. They started. She is at his fence line with her camera in 8 minutes. She arrives slightly out of breath, camera already out, moving directly to the fence line without stopping at the gate. She begins shooting immediately, not the dramatic wide shots of the equipment, but the close, specific, legally significant details that a compliance officer knows to capture. The disturbed root systems of the sedge grass along the buffer zone edge, exposed and pale where the excavator has torn through the surface. The water bleeding laterally from the excavation point into the main channel, carrying a thin plume of displaced soil that clouds the creek for 30 feet downstream. The visible change in ground elevation along the corridor, where the first cleared section now sits 4 inches below the surrounding grade, already filling at the edges with groundwater, seeping in from the saturated substrate. She photographs the soil cross-section exposed in the excavator's wake, the dark, organic-rich wetland profile, layered and distinct, nothing like the upland soil that would make a legitimate road base. She photographs the first delivery truck backing toward the cleared corridor at 10:22 a.m., the gravel fill cascading off the tailgate onto exposed wetland subgrade. She photographs the exact point where the fill material contacts the open water of the creek channel, the moment the violation moves from excavation into discharge, from one federal offense into a compounding one. Everything is labeled as she shoots, time-stamped, GPS tagged. One line of description written into the file name of each image before she moves to the next one. Marcus never stops filming. By 9 a.m., the excavator has cleared a path 12 feet wide through the outer edge of the buffer zone, 60 feet of disturbed wetland surface where there was intact ecology 3 hours ago. By 10:30, the crew is actively placing gravel fill over the exposed subgrade, compacting each layer with a plate tamper before bringing in the next load. The road is taking shape with the efficiency of a crew that has done this kind of work many times before. Competent, fast, completely untroubled by the question of whether what they are building is legal. They have been hired to build a road. They are building a road. That is the entirety of what they know about the situation. Marcus films every delivery truck. He films every load of fill. He films the equipment tracks deepening in the saturated soil along the corridor edge, the ground compressing and displacing under weight it was never designed to bear. He films the crew foreman walking the length of the cleared section at noon, nodding with the satisfaction of someone whose project is on schedule. He films the water continuing to bleed from the disturbed buffer zone into the creek channel throughout the afternoon, the downstream plume never fully clearing between equipment passes. At 2 p.m., a white pickup truck appears on the road running parallel to the property line. It slows to a near stop. Behind the wheel is Gerald Coates, HOA board president, 14-year resident of Ridgecrest, the man whose signature had appeared at the bottom of the community development notice and whose name Marcus had been looking at on certified mail receipts for 3 weeks. Gerald is in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who has run community meetings long enough to mistake procedural authority for actual authority. He does not park. He does not get out of the truck. He does not look toward Marcus's porch, where Marcus is standing with his phone raised and the camera still running. He looks at the road. His expression, visible for the few seconds the truck remains slowed, is the expression of a man surveying progress on something he considers his, the quiet, proprietary satisfaction of someone watching a decision he made become physical reality. The crew is on schedule. The fill is going in cleanly. Phase 1, as he announced in the community email, is proceeding exactly as planned. He accelerates and drives away. Marcus watches the white pickup disappear around the curve of the road. He lowers his phone. He looks at the timestamp on the last clip, 2:04 p.m., and notes it in the running log he has been keeping on a legal pad beside him all day. Gerald Coates, on-site observation, 2 p.m., no contact made, construction ongoing. He picks the phone back up and keeps filming. By 4:30 p.m., the crew has packed up and left. 40 feet of gravel fill now sits across the Cobble Creek buffer zone, where wetland surface existed that morning. The road is not finished. The crew will return. Phase 1 requires at least 2 more days of work, but the violation is complete in every legally meaningful sense. Fill material has been discharged into jurisdictional wetland without a federal permit. The evidence of it is sitting in the open, glistening in the afternoon light, and it is not going anywhere. That evening, Marcus sits at his kitchen table with Diana beside him, and his laptop open. The photograph folder for the day holds 41 images. The video files from his phone run to just over 3 hours of continuous footage. Every timestamp confirmed. Every GPS coordinate logged. Diana reviews the photographs one by one, while Marcus drafts the complaint narrative. She flags 6 images as particularly significant: the lateral water displacement at excavation, the fill to channel contact point, the soil cross-section showing the wetland profile, and writes a 1-line technical annotation beneath each one in the language of someone who has written federal compliance reports for 2 decades. The annotations are precise, unemotional, and damaging. Marcus submits the formal Section 404 complaint to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Buffalo District, at 9:47 p.m. The complaint document runs 11 pages. It cites the statute by number. It references the 2017 jurisdictional designation of Cobble Creek by survey date and Army Corps file number. It attaches all 41 photographs with timestamps, coordinates, and Diana's technical annotations. It describes the construction activity observed that day in chronological order, including the specific times of excavation onset, fill placement, and downstream water displacement. It requests emergency site assessment on the grounds that active fill discharge into a designated jurisdictional wetland is ongoing and will continue. Diana files her parallel report with the State Department of Environmental Conservation at 11:23 p.m. Her report is 4 pages, technically detailed, and filed under her professional credentials as a former state compliance officer. It references the federal complaint by submission timestamp and requests coordinated enforcement review. Marcus closes his laptop at 11:45 p.m. and sits for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen. The legal pad beside him has 3 pages of notes from the day. The desktop folder labeled HOA Road. Cobble Creek has grown from a single scanned letter to 43 documents in 3 weeks. The paper trail, the real one, not the HOA's community notice, has officially begun. Gerald Coates drove past the construction site today. Marcus Webb documented a federal violation. Those are not the same event, even though they happened in the same place on the same afternoon. One of them will matter in the weeks ahead. The other will not. Marcus turns off the kitchen light and goes to bed. Diana does the same, 2 houses over, with the particular, settled quiet of someone who has done everything that could be done today and knows exactly what comes next. The morning after the complaints are filed, Marcus wakes up early and checks the Army Corps public database before making coffee. Nothing yet. He makes the coffee, sits at the kitchen table with his laptop, and checks again. The complaint submission confirmation is there. Timestamp, reference number, the automated acknowledgement that the filing had been received by the Buffalo District Office. But the case status shows no movement beyond intake. No assigned inspector. No scheduled assessment. No indication that anything is happening beyond the complaint, existing in a government system somewhere, sitting in a queue with whatever else arrived that week. He closes the laptop and drinks his coffee. Diana calls at 8:30 a.m. She has checked the DEC portal. Same result. Complaint received, no visible action yet. She tells Marcus this is normal. These things don't move in days, she says. They move in weeks, sometimes longer. The important thing is, the clock is running on their end, even when you can't see it. Marcus asks how long typically. Depends on the flagging on the site, Diana says. Cobble Creek has a 2017 jurisdictional designation, with a high sensitivity notation. I put that in my report. If whoever pulls the complaint cross-references that record, it moves faster than a standard intake. But we wait either way. That is what this phase is. He tells her he understands. He is not sure he entirely does. Waiting, for Marcus, is the hardest part of any process. Not because he is impatient by nature, but because waiting means the road is still sitting there, 40 feet of unauthorized fill across a protected wetland, and Gerald Coates is still the HOA board president, and nothing about the surface of the situation has changed since the day the excavator arrived. But Diana has been through this before, many times, from the other side of the desk. He trusts her read on it. He checks the database again on day 2. Nothing. Day 3. Nothing visible. On day 3, Diana walks over in the afternoon and finds Marcus at the kitchen table, with the laptop open and the Army Corps portal on the screen. She sits down across from him and says something she has been waiting to say until she thought he needed to hear it. The clock is running on their end, she tells him. They don't announce it. They don't send updates while the review is in progress. They assign, they research, they confirm jurisdiction, they cross-reference permit history. All of that happens internally. And then one day they just show up. She pauses. That is how it works. The silence right now is not nothing. It is the machinery moving where you cannot see it. Marcus nods. He closes the laptop. They sit for a while in the quiet of the kitchen, drinking coffee, not talking about the road. On day 4, Marcus walks the fence line along the buffer zone edge in the late afternoon and photographs the road from a distance, not for any new legal purpose, but because Diana had told him to keep the daily record running, regardless of whether construction was actively occurring. The road sits unchanged, glistening dully in the low November light, the gravel surface holding its shape with the false confidence of something that does not yet know what is coming for it. The creek runs alongside it, unhurried, doing what the creek has always done. Marcus photographs it and goes back inside. On day 5, Gerald Coates sends a mass community email. The subject line reads, Cobble Creek Access Road, Phase 1 Update. The body of the email is 3 paragraphs, upbeat and register, the kind of community communication designed to make a board president look competent and forward-thinking. Phase 1, Gerald writes, is now substantially complete. The access road has been successfully constructed through the eastern corridor, providing the maintenance vehicle access the board has been planning for 2 years. Phase 2, extending the corridor to the secondary utility junction, will begin planning in the spring, with construction targeted for late April, pending board approval. No mention of Marcus's written objection, which had been delivered certified mail and signed for 3 weeks ago. No mention of federal permit requirements. No mention of the 2017 jurisdictional designation of Cobble Creek. No mention of the 2 agency complaints filed 4 days earlier and currently sitting in government inboxes in 2 separate offices. Gerald's email reads like a dispatch from a parallel version of events, in which none of those things exist, in which the road was simply planned, built, and completed, and the next chapter is already being written. His tone is the tone of a man who has already won. 3 of Marcus's neighbors forward him the email within the hour, each with no message attached, just the forward, as if sending it was itself a form of comment they didn't know how to make in words. A 4th neighbor sends something different. Paul is in his early 30s, a software engineer who moved into Ridgecrest 2 years ago with his wife and their first child. He had watched the construction from his backyard during the days it was active, quietly, saying nothing to anyone. He had seen Marcus filming from the porch. He had noticed Diana at the fence line with her camera. He had read Gerald's email and felt the particular unease of someone who suspects they are being told a version of events that has been carefully edited. He sends Marcus a direct message. Hey, I've been watching what's going on with the road. Gerald's email doesn't add up. Can you tell me what's actually happening? Marcus calls him back within the hour. He walks Paul through the entire sequence. The HOA notice with no permit filing, Diana's assessment of the Section 404 requirement, his written objection and the board's silence, the day of construction, and everything he and Diana had documented. the complaints filed with the Army Corps and the DEC. Paul listens without interrupting, asking one or two quiet, clarifying questions. When Marcus finishes, Paul is silent for a moment. "So Gerald built an illegal road," Paul says. Marcus confirms that is the accurate description of the situation. Paul asks what he can do to help. "Nothing yet," Marcus says. "Just keep watching. When the time comes for people to be in a room and say something, I'll let you know." Paul says he will be there. What Marcus does not know during those 8 days, what he has no way of knowing, because the Army Corps does not send progress updates during an active review, is that his complaint has not been sitting in a general intake queue at all. When the Buffalo District Office received the filing on the evening of the construction day, a clerk ran a standard jurisdictional check on the Cobble Creek corridor address before routing it. The check returned a flag. Jurisdictional wetland, high ecological sensitivity, survey date 2017, active designation. That flag, placed in the system during the 2017 survey, Diana had referenced, means that any complaint involving fill activity in the Cobble Creek buffer zone bypasses standard intake processing and routes directly to a field inspector's active caseload. The complaint lands on Agent Reyes's desk the following morning. She pulls the jurisdictional record first. The 2017 survey is thorough, a full delineation of the buffer zone boundaries, hydrological connectivity mapping, soil sample analysis confirming wetland characteristics throughout the corridor. The designation is unambiguous. Cobble Creek's eastern buffer zone is jurisdictional water of the United States under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act and has been formally designated as such for 7 years. She cross-references the HOA's permit history against the Cobble Creek corridor address. The search returns nothing. No Section 404 individual permit application, no nationwide permit notification, no pre-construction notification of any kind, no emergency authorization, no variance request, no record of any contact between Ridgecrest HOA and the Army Corps of Engineers at any point regarding any project in the Cobble Creek corridor. Gerald Coates had taken a board vote, sent a community notice, hired a construction crew, and built 40 feet of gravel road through a federally designated wetland without filing a single piece of paperwork with the federal government. Agent Reyes reviews the 41 photographs attached to the complaint. She reads Diana's technical annotations beneath each one. She reads the complaint narrative Marcus had written, chronological and specific, with timestamps matching the photograph metadata. She notes the downstream sediment displacement documented in images 36 through 41, fill material entering the creek channel, a secondary violation compounding the original discharge. She marks the case priority, active violation, site visit required. She schedules the visit for the following week and sends a confirmation to the contact email on the complaint. The confirmation arrives in Marcus's inbox on day 6. He reads it twice. He forwards it to Diana with no message. She replies with 2 words, "It worked." On day 6, Marcus checks the fence line again. The road is unchanged. The creek runs alongside it. The gravel surface holds. On day 7, the weather changes. A low-pressure system that has been sitting off the coast for 4 days begins moving inland in the early afternoon, pulling Gulf moisture up through the watershed. By evening, the rain has started, steady, purposeful, the kind of rain that does not intend to stop soon. Marcus checks the weather radar from his kitchen at 10 p.m. and sees the system stalled directly over the region. A dense red core sitting over the watershed with no projected movement for the next 12 hours. 3 inches fall overnight. The Cobble Creek buffer zone receives all of it. The ground, already saturated from the wetland's natural water table, already destabilized by the excavation that had stripped its surface vegetation and disrupted its drainage pathways, already compromised by 40 feet of compacted fill placed directly over the subsurface flow channels Diana had identified in her report, absorbs the first inch quickly and begins to resist the second. By midnight, the water table has risen measurably against the underside of the gravel base. By 2 a.m., the fill material along the lowest section of the road corridor, where the subsurface drainage channel runs closest to the surface, has begun to sink at the edges. The system stalls for another full day on the 8th morning and drops 2 more inches. By noon on the 8th day, the subsidence along the lowest road section is visible from Marcus's fence line, a subtle but unmistakable depression running along the center of the gravel surface, where the base material has lost its bearing capacity. By 3 p.m., the depression has deepened. By 8 p.m., the center line of the affected section has dropped 6 inches below the surrounding grade, and water is pooling across the full width of the road surface, no longer draining laterally because the fill layer beneath has sealed the subsurface pathways it was placed over. By midnight, the hydrostatic pressure beneath the compromised base has reached a threshold the fill material cannot hold. The fracture begins at the lowest point and runs outward in both directions simultaneously, following the center line of the road, the way a crack follows the weakest axis of any material under pressure. It moves fast, not explosively, but with the quiet inevitability of a structure that has been failing from the inside for days and has simply reached the moment of visible resolution. The gravel surface opens. The base material beneath it drops into the void left by the displaced subsurface water. The standing water above rushes in to fill the space. By 3 a.m., a section 20 feet long has dropped completely below the water table. By 5 a.m., the fracture has extended the full 40-foot length of the road. By 6:14 a.m., when Marcus steps out of his back door in rubber boots with a coffee he will set on the fence post and never finish, the road is gone. Agent Reyes arrives on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the collapse. She pulls up in a dark green government vehicle at 8:45 a.m., parks along the access road with the practiced economy of someone who has driven to field sites too many times to give the parking any thought, and steps out carrying a field kit, a camera bag, and a clipboard with a printed site map clipped to the top. She is in her early 40s, compact and deliberate in her movements, dressed in waterproof field gear with Army Corps of Engineers identification stitched on the left chest pocket. She introduces herself to Marcus at the gate with a firm, brief handshake, not unfriendly, but carrying the focused quality of a professional who has a specific job to do and a limited window to do it in. She looks past him toward the wetland before he finishes saying hello. "That the site?" she asks. He confirms it. She opens the gate herself and walks directly toward the collapse without waiting for him to lead. Marcus follows a few steps behind, letting her set the pace. She reaches the edge of the former road corridor and stops at the boundary of the collapse, taking in the full length of it without speaking. She stands there for nearly a full minute. What she is looking at is not what she had been expecting when she reviewed the complaint photographs 4 days earlier. Those images had shown an intact road surface with fill material placed over wetland ground. A clear violation, but a contained one. The kind of site where the evidence sits on top and requires careful documentation to establish what lies beneath. What she is looking at now is the interior of that road. The collapse has done the documentation work that normally requires ground-penetrating equipment and excavation permits. The entire unauthorized fill profile is exposed from top to bottom. Gravel surface, compacted base material, transition zone, and the dark, organic wetland subsoil beneath. Visible in cross-section along the full 40-foot corridor, the way a geological sample core makes visible what is normally sealed underground. Every layer of what Gerald Coates had built without a permit is now sitting open in the November air, available to anyone with a camera and a field notebook. Agent Reyes sets her field kit down and opens it. She begins at the northern end of the collapse and moves south, working methodically, pausing every 6 to 8 feet to crouch and examine the exposed fill cross-section at eye level. She moves with the unhurried precision of someone who has learned through long experience that the value of a field inspection is in the details that a photograph alone cannot establish. The texture of the fill material, the depth of the wetland profile beneath it, the way the two layers interface at the point of contact. She presses a gloved hand into the exposed subsoil at several points, testing saturation, checking the depth at which groundwater is present. She collects soil samples at 6 points along the corridor. At each point, she presses a stainless steel coring tool through the exposed fill and into the wetland subsoil beneath, extracting a column of material that shows the full unauthorized fill sequence in a single sample. She labels each container with a waterproof marker, site code, sample number, depth in centimeters, GPS coordinate, before capping it and moving to the next. The process is thorough and quiet, accompanied only by the sound of the creek running alongside the site and the occasional distant call of a bird in the buffer zone trees. She photographs every sample point from 2 angles. The first shot establishes context, the sample location within the broader collapse, the surrounding wetland, the relationship of the fill material to the creek channel. The second shot is close range, showing the fill cross-section in detail. The clean, commercial gravel of the road base sitting directly atop the dark, root-threaded, organically rich wetland subsoil, with no transition material, no liner, no separation of any kind. Just gravel on wetland, 40 feet of it, placed there without a permit on a Wednesday morning in November by a crew who had been hired to build a road, and had built one. She photographs the fracture line. The center line crack runs the full length of the collapsed corridor, in places wide enough to fit both hands into. The edges of the fracture showing the internal structure of the base material, where it failed under hydrostatic pressure. She photographs it from above, from the side, from the northern and southern ends looking along its length. She notes in her field book that the fracture axis follows the subsurface drainage corridor, identified in the 2017 jurisdictional survey, that the road had been built directly over the primary subsurface flow channel of the buffer zone, and that the hydrostatic failure had followed that channel precisely, as if the wetland had found the exact line of maximum vulnerability and applied pressure there until something gave. She photographs the subsidence zone at the lowest section of the corridor, where the base material had begun failing first, the depression in the surrounding fill still clearly defined and measurable. She photographs the point where the fill material contacts the open creek channel. No silt fence, no erosion barrier, no rock check dam, nothing between the gravel road base and the moving water of the creek. She photographs the downstream sediment plume, a fan-shaped deposit of displaced fill particles, visible in the creek bed for 60 feet below the site, where material disturbed by the collapse and by 9 days of water movement through the compromised fill layer has settled out of suspension into a visible, documentable deposit in federal waters. After the first hour, she walks back to where Marcus is standing at the fence line and asks him to walk the site with her. He falls into step beside her, and she begins asking questions. Her method is specific and sequential. She is not exploring the situation. She is confirming a sequence she has already largely assembled from the complaint documentation. When did construction begin? How many days did active fill placement continue? Was the crew on site every day or intermittent between work days? At any point during construction, were silt fences installed along the buffer zone edge? Were any erosion controls placed between the fill activity and the creek channel? Was any attempt made to redirect surface drainage during the construction period? Did he observe any communication between the construction crew and HOA board members during the work? Marcus answers each question directly, without elaboration, the way Diana had coached him from the beginning. Factual, specific, no interpretation volunteered beyond direct observation. He watched Gerald Coates slow his white pickup truck and observe the construction site from the access road on the first day. At approximately 2 p.m., he filmed it. The timestamp is in the footage metadata. Agent Reyes stops walking. "You have footage of the board president observing active construction on the first day?" she asks. Her tone does not change, but she has stopped moving, which is its own kind of emphasis. Marcus confirms it. Gerald's vehicle is identifiable in the frame. The timestamp reads 2:04 p.m. on the day of construction. She opens her field notebook and writes something. She underlines it. They continue walking. She asks about the certified mail. Marcus tells her about the written objection, drafted the evening after receiving the HOA notice, sent certified mail with return receipt requested, addressed to both the board president and the community management office, both delivered and signed for. He never received a response. She asks when that was relative to the construction start date. Marcus tells her, 3 weeks before the excavator arrived. She writes that down as well. At the midpoint of the second hour, she asks to see his documentation folder. He has brought it. He had set it on the porch railing the previous evening the same way he had set it there on the morning of the collapse, knowing it would be needed. He hands it over and she takes it, holding it on her clipboard and paging through it methodically from the front, reading rather than scanning. She pauses at the original HOA development notice, reading all 3 paragraphs with careful attention, cross-referencing the road dimensions and timeline against her site map. She pauses longer at Diana's 4-page technical assessment, reading through the statute citations and the fill activity descriptions, stopping at the annotated photographs and reading each caption individually. She turns back twice to reread specific sections, the way you reread something when it confirms a technical finding you have independently reached. She reaches Diana's annotation on photograph 17. Fill placement directly over subsurface drainage corridor, eastern margin, confirmed by 2017 survey hydrology mapping, day 3, 2:18 p.m., and holds the folder slightly closer, comparing the image against the site she is standing above. She looks up at Marcus. "Who wrote these annotations?" she asks. Marcus explains, "Diana, 22 years as a state environmental compliance officer, retired, next-door neighbor. She reviewed the 2017 jurisdictional survey when it was filed and recognized the corridor designation in the HOA notice immediately." Agent Reyes looks back at the annotation. "She's correct about the drainage corridor placement," she says. The 2017 survey maps the subsurface flow channel within 4 feet of the center line of this road. She says it the way someone states a measurement, not as a compliment, not as a conclusion, just as a fact that exists independently of anyone's opinion about it. She turns to the certified mail receipt and looks at it for a moment. "They signed for the objection," she says. Marcus confirms it. 3 weeks before construction began. He confirms that too. She closes the folder and hands it back. She looks at Marcus with the level, assessing expression of someone completing a picture they have been building from multiple sources. "You film this every day?" she asks. The question arrives quietly, almost as an aside, but it is not casual. It is the question of someone who has reviewed a lot of complaints and does not often encounter this level of continuous documentation from a private citizen. Marcus tells her yes. Every day of active construction. 3 hours of footage total, time-stamped and continuous. The same phone orientation each day, so the site geometry is consistent across clips. She nods once, not an approving nod, not a congratulatory one. The nod of someone who has just confirmed the last detail they needed to confirm. She goes back to her notes. Diana arrives at the fence line at 11:30. Having watched the government vehicle from her kitchen window for the past 2 hours, and waited until it seemed appropriate to appear. She and Marcus stand at the fence rail together and watch Agent Reyes complete her final circuit of the site, a slow, deliberate walk of the full perimeter, photographing the buffer zone boundary markers, the creek channel downstream, the access corridor that the construction equipment had used to enter the site. She photographs the equipment track still visible in the soft ground along the corridor edge, preserved by the cold and the subsequent rain, into a clear record of the machinery that had been there. "She's thorough," Diana says quietly. Marcus watches Agent Reyes crouch at the downstream sediment plume and photograph it a 4th time from a new angle. "That's good," Diana adds. Thorough means the report doesn't leave openings for Gerald's attorney to find. At 12:50 p.m., Agent Reyes packs her field kit, caps her sample containers, and walks back toward the gate. She stops in front of Marcus and Diana and reaches into the side pocket of her clipboard, producing a 2-page document that she holds out to Marcus. He takes it. The header reads, "Notice of Violation. United States Army Corps of Engineers, Buffalo District. Unauthorized discharge of fill material into waters of the United States. Section 404, Clean Water Act. The violation is issued to Ridgecrest Homeowners Association. The site description identifies the Cobble Creek Buffer Zone corridor by GPS coordinates and legal land description. The violation description runs 3 full paragraphs, technically precise, citing the 2017 jurisdictional designation by survey file number, describing the unauthorized fill activity by date range and estimated cubic yard volume, noting the absence of any permit application in Army Corps records, and identifying the secondary violation of fill material displacement into the creek channel as a compounding discharge event. Restoration costs estimated, $47,000. The mandatory compliance order occupies the bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2. Full removal of all unauthorized fill material from the buffer zone corridor. Restoration of natural hydrology to pre-construction condition, including reopening of subsurface drainage pathways, replanting of all disturbed wetland surface with native species appropriate to the buffer zone ecology, and submittal of a restoration completion report to the Buffalo District Office. Compliance deadline, 90 days from the notice date. Marcus reads it through once, standing at the gate in the cold November air. He reads it a second time more slowly, absorbing the specific language of each provision. Then he looks up. Agent Reyes is already halfway to her vehicle. "You'll receive a copy by certified mail within 5 business days," she says, not turning back. The HOA will receive theirs simultaneously through the same channel. Questions about the restoration order process go to the contact number on page 2. She gets in the vehicle, pulls the door closed, and drives away down the access road without looking back at the site. Marcus stands at the gate for a long moment. The wetland behind him sits quiet in the midday light. The collapsed road corridor runs along the water's edge, still and exposed, the creek moving past it the way it always has, unhurried, indifferent, already in the long process of clearing the sediment plume and returning to itself. Diana is standing beside him, reading over his shoulder, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. He walks to the porch and sits on the top step. He picks up his phone and calls Diana, who is still standing at the fence line 8 feet away. She answers on the first ring, walks toward the porch as the phone connects, and sits down on the step beside him. "It's done," he says. She is quiet for a moment. "What did the restoration figure come to?" 47,000, Marcus says. The pause that follows is not long, but it holds something. The full accumulated weight of a process that had started with a single-page notice in a mailbox 4 months ago and had run through certified mail receipts and early mornings on the porch with a phone camera and 41 photographs, and 8 days of silence and 2 inches of rain and a road that had tried to exist somewhere it had no right to exist. All of it compressed into a 2-page government document with a dollar figure at the bottom. "Gerald built a $47,000 mistake," Diana says. Marcus looks out at the water. The heron is back, standing in the shallows 20 feet downstream of the collapsed corridor, motionless, completely unbothered by the outcome of federal regulatory proceedings. "Yeah," he says, "he did." They sit on the porch steps for a while without talking, the notice of violation resting on Marcus's knee, the creek running past the site of the road that is no longer there. That evening, just after 7, his phone rings with Paul's number. Paul had heard through 2 neighbors during the afternoon that a government vehicle had been at the Wetlands site most of the morning, that Marcus had been seen at the gate reading something, that Diana had been there too, that whatever had been building for the past several weeks appeared to have reached some kind of conclusion. He asks Marcus directly what happened. Marcus walks him through it carefully and completely. The arrival of Agent Reyes, the 4-hour inspection, the soil samples and photographs and field notes, the moment she had asked about the certified mail receipt and written something down and underlined it, the notice of violation, its terms, the $47,000 restoration figure, the 90-day compliance deadline, the fact that the violation is issued to the HOA as an association, which means the financial and legal exposure sits with the board collectively, not with a contractor, not with a crew, with the board that authorized the project and the president who signed the notice. Paul listens to all of it without interrupting. When Marcus finishes, the line is quiet for a moment. "So Gerald is personally on the hook for this," Paul says. Marcus explains the distinction. Gerald is not personally named in the notice of violation. The HOA is. But the board authorized the project. Gerald signed the notice. Gerald was observed on site during active construction. Gerald sent the community email declaring Phase 1 complete, with no mention of permit requirements or federal complaints. When the board convenes to respond to the notice of violation, every one of those facts will be in the room. Paul absorbs this. Another pause. "I want to be at that board meeting," he says. Marcus thinks about the community email. Phase 1 substantially complete. Phase 2 planning begins in spring, and the tone of a man who had built a road through a federal wetland and sent a neighborhood newsletter about it. That, Marcus says, would be a very good idea. The notice of violation arrives at the Ridgecrest HOA management office by certified mail the morning after Agent Reyes's visit. The office manager signs for it at 9:17 a.m., opens it, reads the header, and calls Gerald Coates before she finishes the first paragraph. Gerald is at his kitchen table when the call comes in. He listens to her read the document aloud, asks her to read the restoration figure a second time, and sits quietly for a moment after she does. By noon, he has sent a board-wide message calling an emergency meeting for that evening at 7 o'clock. The message characterizes the notice of violation as a matter requiring immediate board attention, and describes the situation as a regulatory misunderstanding that the board needs to address collectively. He does not attach the notice of violation to the message. He does not use the word federal. He does not mention the dollar figure. 3 of the 7 board members who received the message call their personal attorneys before the meeting. 2 of them arrive that evening with printed copies of the notice of violation, obtained through their own channels, not through Gerald, covered in handwritten margin notes. The other 2 arrive having spoken to neighbors who had been watching the wetlands situation develop for weeks, and who had formed their own conclusions about what had gone wrong and why. Paul arrives as a community observer, along with 4 other residents who had heard through the neighborhood that something significant had happened at the Cobble Creek site, and that the evening's meeting would determine what came next. They take seats along the wall at the back of the room. Gerald looks at them when they enter, but says nothing. The meeting opens at 7. Gerald stands at the front of the room with the particular posture of a man who has decided that the best available strategy is to control the framing before anyone else can establish it. He speaks for 11 minutes without pausing to take questions. His argument runs in 3 overlapping threads: that the Army Corps of Engineers has overreached in applying federal jurisdiction to a routine community infrastructure project, that the notice of violation reflects an overly aggressive regulatory interpretation that the board has every right to contest, and that Marcus Webb's complaints had artificially escalated a neighborhood disagreement into a federal matter that could have been resolved through community dialogue. He does not mention the Section 404 permit requirement. He does not mention the 2017 jurisdictional designation. He does not mention the certified mail receipt, confirming that Marcus's written objection had been delivered and signed for 3 weeks before construction began. He does not mention that the board's own HOA attorney had not been consulted before the project commenced. When he finishes, the room is quiet for a moment. Then Carol Hendricks, joining by phone, asks to speak. Carol has represented Ridgecrest HOA for 6 years. She has handled covenant disputes, assessment collection actions, contractor liability claims, and 2 previous board governance matters that required careful navigation. She is a measured professional who chooses her words with the precision of someone who understands that every word said in a room like this one is potentially a word that will later be read in a deposition. Her tone when she speaks is flat and careful, the tone of a professional who is working very hard to remain professionally composed in a situation that has made that composure genuinely difficult to maintain. She begins by asking the board to confirm that she is speaking on the record. The board secretary confirms it. Carol informs the board that the association faces federal restoration liability of at minimum $47,000, as stated in the notice of violation, with the actual figure potentially higher, depending on the complexity of the restoration work once contractors are engaged. She informs them that Section 309 of the Clean Water Act provides for civil penalties of up to $25,000 per day of ongoing violation, and that the violation, as defined by the Army Corps, began on the first day of construction and continues until the unauthorized fill is fully removed and the site is restored. She informs them that the parallel complaint filed with the State Department of Environmental Conservation remains active and that state enforcement action is independent of the federal process, meaning the association faces potential liability on 2 separate regulatory tracks simultaneously. She pauses to let that settle. Then she tells them that the board president had proceeded with construction activity in a federally designated wetland, a designation on record since 2017 and publicly accessible through Army Corps jurisdictional records, without obtaining a Section 404 permit under the Clean Water Act. She tells them that a Section 404 permit requirement is not an obscure or technical threshold. It is a standard federal compliance requirement that appears in the first tier of any environmental review checklist used by municipal planners, HOA attorneys, and land use consultants across the country. Any legal or professional review of the project prior to construction would have identified it within the first hour of analysis. Another pause. "I was not consulted before this project began," Carol says. Her voice does not change register. It does not need to. "I want that on the record." The room is very quiet. Gerald shifts his weight at the front of the room. He opens his mouth once and closes it. The board members along the table are not looking at him. Several of them are looking at the printed copy of the notice of violation on the table in front of them. One of them is looking at the wall. Paul, sitting along the back wall, is looking at Gerald with the focused, patient expression of someone who came to this room to watch something finish. Gerald attempts a recovery. He suggests that Marcus's complaints had been the precipitating cause of the regulatory response, that without the Army Corps complaint, the road would have stood, and the community would have benefited from the access it was designed to provide. Two board members respond to this directly, not aggressively, but clearly, pointing out that a federal violation is a federal violation, regardless of whether a complaint is filed, and that the complaint had not created the violation, the construction had. Gerald tries a second angle. He argues that the road project had been genuinely in the community's best interest, that the maintenance access it provided was a legitimate operational need the board had discussed for 2 years, and that the outcome, however unfortunate, did not mean the underlying goal was wrong. A board member named Susan, who has sat quietly through the entire meeting until this point, looks up from her copy of the notice of violation and says, "Gerald, we needed access to the utility corridor. We did not need a $47,000 federal violation and a mandatory restoration order. Those are not the same thing." The room does not disagree with her. A third board member, Raymond, who had arrived with the most heavily annotated copy of the notice, asks Carol directly whether the board members carry personal liability exposure for a project authorized by board vote. Carol says that depends entirely on what the board does next. If the board moves immediately to comply with the restoration order, engages a qualified wetland contractor, and cooperates fully with the Army Corps compliance process, the association's exposure is largely contained to the restoration cost and potential civil penalties for the period of violation already accrued. If the board contests the notice of violation without strong legal grounds, and Carol is telling them clearly that those grounds do not exist, the per-day penalty clock continues to run throughout the contest period, potentially multiplying the financial exposure significantly. Raymond asks what contesting the findings would cost in legal fees alone. Carol gives him a range. The lower end of it is uncomfortable. The upper end of it, if the matter goes to federal administrative hearing, is considerably more than $47,000. The meeting continues for another 40 minutes after that. Gerald speaks twice more, briefly, and neither intervention changes the direction of the room. The board votes at 9:15 p.m. to engage a wetland restoration contractor for a compliance assessment and to respond to the Army Corps notice of violation with a letter of acknowledgement and intent to comply. The vote is unanimous. Gerald votes with the rest of them, which is the most telling moment of the evening. The vote of a man who has read the room and understands that the only remaining question is how much damage control is still possible. He does not call another meeting after that one. 11 days later, the Ridgecrest HOA board convenes a second session. The agenda has one item, a motion to remove Gerald Coates from the position of board president, citing the unauthorized initiation of a construction project in a federally regulated wetland without legal review, without permit compliance, and without consultation with the association's retained legal counsel, resulting in a federal notice of violation and mandatory restoration liability of no less than $47,000. The motion is read aloud by the board secretary. Gerald sits at the table and listens to it without expression. The vote is called. 6 in favor, 1 opposed. Gerald casts the single vote in his own favor, which is either an act of principle or an act of stubbornness. And at this point, the distinction does not particularly matter. Paul is sitting along the back wall when the vote is announced. He takes out his phone and types a message to Marcus before the board secretary has finished recording the result. It's done, 6-1. Marcus is standing at the wetland edge when the message arrives. He has been out there for 20 minutes in the cold evening air, not for any particular reason, not to document anything, not to check on the site, just standing at the edge of Cobble Creek the way he has stood there many times over the past 4 months, watching the water move. The restoration crews are scheduled to begin work the following week. A wetland contractor retained by the HOA has already conducted the compliance assessment and submitted the restoration plan to the Army Corps for review. Every cubic yard of unauthorized fill will be extracted. The subsurface drainage pathways will be mechanically reopened. The disturbed wetland surface will be replanted with native sedge, rush, and buffer zone vegetation at the HOA's expense. The work is estimated to take 3 weeks. Marcus reads Paul's message once. He puts the phone back in his pocket He looks at the water. The creek runs the way it has always run through this ground, unhurried, directional, following the path of least resistance, through the buffer zone, the way it has for longer than the neighborhood around it has existed. The collapsed road material is still partially visible at the water's edge, the last of it waiting to be removed by crews, who will arrive with equipment and permits and all the paperwork that Gerald had decided not to bother with. The cattails along the bank are undisturbed. The heron, somewhere downstream, is presumably standing in the shallows being a heron, entirely unimpressed by the resolution of human regulatory disputes. Marcus had never gone to court. He had never stood in front of a judge. He had never hired an attorney, never filed a lawsuit, never needed to escalate beyond the 2 complaints he had submitted on the night of the first day of construction. One to the Army Corps, one to the DEC, and the 3 phone calls he had taken from Agent Reyes in the weeks that followed. He had filed 2 complaints, answered 3 phone calls, and waited. Diana had documented. Paul had shown up. Carol Hendricks had said 5 words into a conference phone. I was not consulted before this. That had done more damage to Gerald's position than 4 months of paperwork, and the wetland had handled the rest. Not as a metaphor, not as a rhetorical flourish, literally. The water table had risen, the hydrostatic pressure had built, the fracture had found the center line. By 6:14 a.m. on the 9th day, the road had ceased to exist, and it had taken Gerald Coates' tenure as board president with it, just on a slightly longer timeline. Marcus stands at the edge of Cobble Creek for a few more minutes in the cold evening air. Then he turns and walks back toward the house, leaving the water to move through the buffer zone the way it has always moved, quietly, persistently, without anyone's permission, and without any particular interest in being thanked for it.